All right, just so everyone understands, you graduated from St. Augustine's College, and then you went on to QC.
Right.
And that was to study law?
No, I went there to study, to do my A-levels. You're probably too young to know this thing. But back in the day, you had O-levels. These were English examinations that were the standard here. So you did your O-levels in regular high school. And then if you wanted to do A-levels, which was A for advanced levels, you'd have to go to either Government High, the Government High, or Queen's College, okay? I was awarded a scholarship, actually the Roy West Scholarship, to go to Queen's College, where I was head boy at Queen's College. And I didn't get very far. Well, no, I shouldn't say. I did the first year there, and then I was involved in radical left-wing politics back then. I was the president of Unicom, even though I was only 17. And it was a very radical organization for its time. You know, we burned the flag, Union Jack on Clifford Park as a protest against colonialism, did all kinds of things like that. But anyway, I made a speech as head boy at the annual graduation ceremonies in which I decried the fact that QC wasn't teaching anything Bahamian. And all we had was a bunch of English teachers, right? There were no Bahamian teachers at all. So it was a twofold thing. I said, one, we didn't have any Bahamian curriculum. We all knew the length and depth of the Thames River, but we didn't know anything about the Bahamas. There was no Bahamian history being taught. And all of the teachers were English, as I said. So that was the focal point of my address. I also criticized the school's lack of a social conscience, really, in that it was making it difficult for the kids who lived in Kemp Road, which was right next door, to come and use the basketball court and athletic facilities after hours when no one else was there. There was a stern resistance to that. So I mentioned that as well. Anyway, cut a long story short, the speech did not go over well. And I was told I had to either recant the speech, because it was carried publicly, or I'd be expelled. And I said, well, I'm not going to recant the speech. So I was expelled. And that was the end of my formal education, really.
And that was the criticism that you received from the adults. But what about your peers? What did your peers have to say? Especially because I think QC at that time was like elitist. So for you advocating for kids in Kemp Road to come on basketball.
Yeah, it was, well, there was a bit of I also spoke of the fact that there was a racial divide at QC. Remember, QC had come out of a period where it was primarily a white school, and it only became seriously integrated after the PLP won in '67 with majority rule. There was a sort of sudden transformation of the school in terms of the racial demographics. So I think the white kids and their parents were, of course, up in arms over this and didn't understand how this crazy boy could have been made a cute head boy to begin with. And they blamed the headmaster for that, Neville Stewart. And they eventually got rid of him too, the Methodist Church. He was like fired later on the same year that I was made to leave. So it was a mixed bag. I mean, there were demonstrations at the school. They almost had a riot up there. And parents were driving up in the middle of the day to take their kids out of school because they thought there was going to be mayhem and that sort of thing. Those were the days,
You said that your parents supported you in this.
Yeah, they did.
And speaking of your parents, your dad was an American.
American, yeah.
So face everything that was going on in the Bahamas at that time, in the Caribbean. I wouldn't just say in the Bahamas. Sometimes a lot of countries experience like an exodus of their people,
right,
due to the battles that they had to face at home. What people would consider you had like a gateway to leave to go to America. So why stay here and fight, especially being so young?
I never ever even thought about leaving. Never ever even thought about that. And I think very few Bahamians back then thought about leaving. The Bahamas, was a place of great promise. Great promise. Even though for those who were opposed to the PLP, it was still a land of plenty for them. Pinling had made it clear when he came to power in 1967 that he hadn't come to destroy the old Bay Street regime, that they could continue with their stuff. He was going to build a parallel regime for black Bahamians. So although there were a few white Bahamians who did leave, most of those came back too. Most of them stayed and continued to flourish. And in fact, there was a saying that whites had flourished even better under Pinling than they had under Stafford Sands, right? They continued to grow from strength to strength. So very few people thought about leaving. Now when independence came, they went up to independence in '72, the campaign for independence. There was a much greater interest expressed by white Bahamians, particularly those who were Abaco connected, to leave, particularly after the secessionist movement failed. But nearly all those people came right back, if they left at all,
And you, speaking of Pinling, let me move into political life. You served as Attorney General. And you also said that Pinling tried his very hardest to get you to run.
He did. Well, before I became Attorney General, I was chairman of the PLP for 5 years, 5 consecutive terms.
Yes.
During that very difficult period when Hubert Ingram and Perry Christie were sidelined and went off to do their own thing. I was chairman during that period, and during that very difficult period associated with what we call the drugs era. So from 1984 to 1989, I was the chairman of the PLB, and a very, very active, very vocal chairman. During that period, Pinling was always, because I was very, very close to Pinling. Pinling was the leader of the party, and I was chairman. So we naturally collaborated very closely. He was always trying to get me to run. And actually, there was one time when there was a picture in the Tribune where they'd actually done a very professionally done sign announcing me as the PLP candidate for Centerville against Perry Christie, which I knew nothing about. But I always made it very clear that I thought that I was, and I think the phrase that was quoted in the papers was that I felt that I was temperamentally unsuited to be an MP, because I didn't have any time for that stuff. Matter of fact, I did try it, I did try to go into a constituency and just see what it was like. And that experience of just a couple of weeks convinced me that, this was not for me. Because I went into Oaks Field, which was in need of a new MP because the then MP, Philip Pinder, had basically gone back to the States, moved to the States. And Tommy Turnquist was the MP, I think, in the neighboring constituency. Well, certainly the candidate. And but that experience showed me that wasn't for me. The demands of constituents, and which I just thought was so unreasonable, and that there was never any sense of appreciation for anything you did. It was always more, 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 and it was always about what can I get rather than what I can give. So it just turned me off completely. So I was always in the Senate, which didn't have constituents. So from 1985 to 1992, I was in the Senate. So but in answer to your question, Pinling tried numerous times to get me to run, and I told him I wasn't interested.
And I want to go back to when you said that you served as chairman. And persons in the public may not understand completely what the role of the chairman is in a political party. And one of the things that the role that a chairman has is keeping the party together. You said at that time both Hubert Ingram and Mr. Christie were sidelined. How did you keep the party together while all of that was going on?
Well, I think I like to think that I helped to re-energize the party. We were very active at the branch level, revitalizing the branches, getting the branches back on a good, solid footing. We had some really good conventions during that period, which again helped to revitalize the party. And I was always in the papers, responding to something the F&M said, or matter of fact, at one time I was dubbed the press release chairman. But so I think we were very much in the forefront, and I think PLPs thought that that there was hope, and we won in 1987. A lot of people didn't think we were going to win. That was a big shock for the F&M. The F&M was convinced they were going to win the 1987 election. I always said that, and still say now, that the quietest I've ever heard Nassau at night was the night of the 1987 election. It was the quietest night I've ever heard. You could hear a pin drop no matter where you drove. because F&Ms were in a state of disbelief. They couldn't believe that they'd lost. They were so convinced they were going to win. They did win 5 years later, but not in 1987.
I want to make sure I get this correct. You were on the Legacy podcast last year.
Yes, yeah.
And I want to quote something that was said.
Sure.
And that is, we have not reached a point in history, where our history is understood. And you mentioned that you don't think you and Mr. the Butlers, our history is being appreciated. How does that make you feel as a freedom fighter?
Well, I think I take a more philosophical view about it now than I did before. And I like to quote I think it was Chiang Kai-shek who said that someone asked him, what did he think the impact of the French Revolution was on Western civilization? Of course, the French Revolution had taken place 200 years before, or close to 200 years. And he very solemnly said it was much too early to say. It was 200 years ago. And so I feel a little bit about that in relation to the modern political development of the Bahamas. It's still very early on. And maybe we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves in not fully understanding and not fully digesting and not fully appreciating, the great strides that we have in fact made, while at the same time probing the great failures that have in fact emerged during that same period. I think time, gives you a greater degree of objectivity than you can now have. And those of us who are combatants, like myself and Carl, it's even more difficult for us because we were actually in the trenches, so to speak, proverbially speaking. And so it's even more difficult for us who quasi-historians to be writing about events of which we ourselves were a part. So I think that's one of the complications. But as time goes on, it's going to become a lot easier to look back and say, oh, I see now something that I couldn't see and appreciate when I was actually a part of the scene, Mm-hmm. But I think the other point, which I'm sure you're driving at, is that I think Bahamians need to develop, though, a greater appreciation of history generally, a greater interest in history generally. There's, really appalling ignorance out there about some really basic things about the development of the Bahamas, an ignorance of the key personalities who helped make and shape the modern Bahamas. And I think that is where the schools in particular are going to have to step up their game and make sure that at least the fundamentals are known to all students,
And my last question is,
Sure.
I'm sure there's going to be persons when they begin to watch this or dig more about you. They're going to be like, oh, he sat in government. Oh, he was a part of transitioning committees. Why didn't he do more? When it comes to that question being asked from persons, what would your response be?
I think those of us who have been in public life always have a sense of regret over things that we should have done and could have done and didn't do. I'm extremely suspicious of anybody who gets in front of a microphone and says that he has no regrets, that he did all that he could have done and left nothing, on the table. That is simply not honest. The fact is that all of us, looking back, realize there were things we could have done, some things we could have done differently, some things we could have done that we didn't do. And so I think there are always going to be those regrets. It's not a perfect world. You do the best you can at the time you're doing it, but with the realization that there is going to come a time when you look back and you are going to have a reckoning with yourself, where you realize that more could have been done. But that's human nature. There's a very famous scene in Schindler's List, about the German man who assisted in saving so many lives of Jews during World War II, saved them from the Holocaust. and at the end of the movie, when he's sort of being gathered, he's surrounded by these survivors, so many of these Jewish survivors, who were thanking him for what he did. And rather than responding to it positively, he says, there's so much more I could have done. And he starts looking, he takes his watch off. He had a very expensive watch. He says, I could have sold this watch, and with this watch I could have gotten, X marks, or whatever the currency was, and I could have saved another life with this. And he says, look at this car. I have a big, expensive car. I could have sold this, and I could have saved 4 more lives. The point is that he realized that there was so much more he could have done. And I think that's the way those of us in public life who look back honestly feel as well, that yes, you can certainly take pride and blow your own horn for the things that you did, but there are a lot of things that you didn't do. And in the interest of balance, remember not only your triumphs, but also remember your failures. And that's one of the big problems we have. Someone was telling me the other day that, those politicians, they like this talk, this rhetoric of saying, oh, I made mistakes and all that, but they never name one. That to do it next time you interview them, ask them, well, name the things that you think you failed at or didn't do. And I can guarantee that nearly all of them are not going to be able to come up with anything, because it's just rhetoric. They honestly don't think that they really did anything that they shouldn't have done, or that there was more that they could have done. So it's a good test to put them to. When they say, yes, of course I made mistakes, of course I made failures, say name one.
That was perfect. Thank you so much, Mr.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.